Hello and welcome to our series on how to thrive in the age of disruption. Today we'll be talking about what companies need to do now. And today we have two special panelists, Frank Wander, CEO and founder of People Productive, and we also have Jason Burnham, CEO and founder of Culture Design. So Jason, Frank, welcome.
Welcome. Glad to be here. Very important topic.
Absolutely. So let's go ahead and get started. Frank, what do we need to do now to create thriving organizations?
Well, this is an age of disruption. And the reality is, the world periodically goes through these times. There's a very interesting book, The Fourth Turning by Strauss and Howe. I've read it a few times. Came out in the 90s, but it predicts based on historical patterns where we are now. And you can look back in history. There was a period in England in 1600s, I think it was called the Glorious Revolution. Then, 80 years later, we get to the American Revolution, starts in 1783. 80 years later, we're at the Civil War and the whole Reconstruction, that whole period. And you take 1860, and pretty soon you're in the 1930s, and now, 80 years later brings us into the 2020s. And so this is a repeating pattern. And I think companies need to have very, very resilient cultures. They need to have cultures where people are engaged. They need to have trust-based cultures where leaders can get in front of them, tell them what's happening with complete openness and transparency. They need to be able to communicate and rally people, use organizational energy as a tool to overcome these hurdles and humps that come along in these periods. Because this is going to be about who survives and comes out the other side. And it's manifesting itself, this age of disruption, in so many things. New ways of working, political systems under attack, financial systems, you name it, kind of a global realignment going on. So expect the unexpected. That's what I say.
Yeah, I'd love to build on Frank's thought there. When we start to look at these fourth turnings, we also have to appreciate that we've only really been a socially connected world for the past 20 plus years or so, right? And the internet, I would say, has been is not just causing one of the biggest disruptions in the human experience, but also accelerating the pace of change. So, as Frank mentioned, right, as we look at these kind of fourth turnings and seeing these cycles of change happening every century or so, those timelines are going to start to become a lot more condensed. So the types of changes we used to see that would happen over the course of centuries are now going to happen in decades. And what we saw happen in decades, we will now see in years, right? And companies have to recognize that they're going to be operating in a constant age of disruption, primarily because the pace of change is accelerating at such a rapid and exponential rate.
Jason, that sounds really scary. Always needing to change. I'd imagine there are tons and tons of leaders out there that fear this disruption, but why embrace it?
Well, I would just say that we've always changed, right? I mean, we evolve, right? We are a species that is in a constant state of change. So we should not fear change, right? And contrary to popular belief, people don't fear change. They fear uncertainty, right? They fear uncertainty for what the future is. And some of the challenges that people are up against right now is that they have, to your point, right? We have all of these systems that are very vulnerable right now. And it's moved into the mainstream, that vulnerability. And, and people are starting to have serious concerns about what the future holds for them. And that happens at every scale of society, right? So whether that's through our national and global discourse or within our organizations, unless people understand why we're changing, that the purpose of this change will actually yield better outcomes, and it's not just necessarily going to lead to a greater stress and more uncertainty. That's why leaders, it's really important for them to communicate the why behind any change initiatives and demonstrate and visualize the value for people for any new change initiative that's underway, and also making changes that are aligned to how we are evolving socially. Right. And I think that's been the biggest challenge with technology to date, is that technological innovation is accelerating beyond the human capacity for being able to kind of keep up with those changes, which is why we're starting to see this big resistance against a lot of what we're seeing happening in society.
Absolutely. And it sounds like it can certainly be stressful. Frank, I'm going to turn to you. There's this massive mental health crisis taking place right now. what can organizations do to really, I guess, mitigate the impact?
Well, I think organizations have to be very careful not to add to the stress loads that people are feeling. People are under more stress than ever. You have inflation, people unable to pay their bills, a lot of uncertainty in the workplace, uncertainty at home. They've come out of COVID, which was a mental health crisis as well as a health crisis. And, people haven't fully recovered from that. And so, as Jason said, this is a period of constant change. We know from other fourth turnings, you do level out at some point into a new period where things have realigned, been reimagined, things start to stabilize. We're nowhere near that. We've got years to go. And companies have to be aware that this is going on. They have to make mental health a priority. They have to be aware of it. A lot of them have employee assistance programs where people can reach out for help. It's not something to be ashamed of. People need help from time to time in their life. They should have no fear of going. It should be a public issue. They should encourage people to take advantage of the resources. And leaders in particular are so important at this moment in time. It's not just that, you look at a period of instability versus stability, and you realize that this notion of strategic trust, our leaders are going to get us to a safe and good future. That is more important than ever now. When times are stable and every quarter everybody hits earnings and things are growing, there's no problem. And this is this whole bull market, bear market leadership. This age of disruption is more of a bear market leadership paradigm where there's a lot of uncertainty, and the leaders must become great communicators. They need those fireside chats. They've got to get people to understand there is a plan. Things are unfolding. They're resilient. They're going to react to it. They're not going to sit idly by and be a victim, because it is act or be acted upon. And that's where we've ended up. So that notion of strategic trust, being open and honest about mental health and what's going on, all of this really matters. And that's going to culminate in your company thriving versus others. And it's all the actions these leaders take. There are going to be winners and losers. You want to be one of the winners. And a lot of it's going to come down to the leaders and how they lead their flock through this.
Frank, you bring up a great point. You said organizations need to become resilient. And I know that you very frequently say that organizations need to become deeply human. So how does an organization, I guess, strategically build resiliency into what they do on a daily basis?
Well, I think, look, I'll go into that in a minute and then pass it off to Jason, because I hate stealing the screen here.
Sure.
But, there is cognitive and emotional resilience, and you've got to build it. You've got to understand that bad things happen and you're going to work your way through it. There's a level of confidence to that. You don't want to overreact and show you're stressed out. You want to be basically, a stable foundation as a leader for people when things are uncertain or bad things happen. Bad things happen. That's just the way it goes. And how you react to them and handle them is really this final chapter that's getting written about how you responded and what the outcome was. And cognitive resilience is that ability as a leader to not talk about the negative, but to say, look, I see there's a bright light here. This is where we could go with this. To reaffirm and show people that there is a path through it, to rebuild the confidence, to win them over. And, that cognitive resilience and this ability to be a great communicator, this is the stuff that gets organizations really through these tough times. It's when you don't feel that leadership communication and that arm around their shoulder, that they're going to be in even more pain and uncertainty given what's going on. It's going to hurt the human infrastructure. Human infrastructure shuts down. Sorry, folks. That's the way it works. And if you're not leading and keeping the human infrastructure humming along so that your company can move fast, react, and take corrective measures, then you're going to struggle. Jason?
Yeah.
Jason, how about yourself?
Yeah. So I would echo that sentiment. I think the big thing I would caveat is the difference between individual resiliency versus organizational resiliency, right? And going back to the mental health issues, it's important to recognize that what we've experienced over the past few years is cultural trauma, right? It has affected us, at the individual level. It's affected us at the societal levels, and we need to come to terms in recognizing that we all of us, every single one of us, has some sort of impact as a result of this trauma that is going to manifest one way or another through mental health conditions, right? I'm sure I'm not alone in saying that, hey, sometimes I'm just a little more short fused these days, right? Like I get a little bit more agitated quicker. I mean, for me last year, I was languishing last year. I mean, even just sometimes finding the motivation to do certain types of things. And I was very intentional in trying to be very present with my emotions and what I was feeling. And I think for leaders specifically, the first thing leaders need to do is come to this acceptance, right? They need to accept that it's not just their people, but it's also themselves, and trying to reflect more about how they're showing up on a day-to-day basis and being cognizant of their own mental health and how that is manifesting in terms of how they're managing a team. Now, in terms of the organizational resiliency, well, this is, yes, while organization consists of individuals, the resiliency of an organization is about how adaptable you can be amidst, massive disruptive change, right? So let's use a COVID, for example. COVID was a massive disruption that nobody anticipated. And as a result, it disrupted global supply chains that we're still struggling through today. Well, let's remember the reason for that is because we've spent decades of companies focusing in on operational efficiencies and really trying to look at ways of actually reducing any kind of redundancies, in the processes in order to reduce waste and to maximize profits. But in order to be resilient, you've actually got to build in some redundancies into the system, because if one area of the system fails, you need to make sure that you can quickly shift to another area of the system. And as an organization, the structural system around functions and departments and even physical locations have become some barriers to people being adaptive and agile, right? I mean, it's been all the rage for the past 10 years now, right? There's how to become more agile as an organization. Well, being agile is about being adaptive to not just the changes, that are massive disruptions like a pandemic, if you will, but also just disruptions to competition. And I think that's going to be the biggest challenge of big companies moving forward, is how they're going to be able to keep up with the pace of innovation that smaller firms, who are more agile, who can be much more adaptive and willing to embrace, an uncertain future and being able to innovate around that, are the ones that will excel in that process.
And it's really how well we work together. And, Jason, you founded Culture Design. So let's take a step back. What is culture and how does it evolve?
Yeah. So, I always, my definition of culture is that it is the behavioral manifestation of collective consciousness. Okay. Now that, and I say that because, I think all too often organizations, when they think of culture, and especially, I think, just for a point of clarity too, right? Because especially my company's name is Culture Design. The question, and some of the philosophical debates that I get into are people going, well, culture is an outcome. You can't really design culture. It's actually true. I mean, we're getting into semantics, but you can design a system that is designed for positive emergence, right? And so when we start to, what I mean by that is you can actually create an operating system, right, by design, right, that will lead to more positive outcomes, and more specifically for organizations, designed in a way that yields your strategic goals and outcomes, right? And so as we think about culture, culture really breaks down into 4 key disciplines: how we innovate and execute new ideas and strategies, how we communicate and educate our ecosystem of stakeholders, how we operationalize new systems and processes, right, and the governance to support that, and how we're rewarding and recognizing behaviors. That defines culture at every scale of society. I mean, at the global level, all the way down to the organizational level. So as we start to think about areas around how do we evolve culture, I would start with saying, well, culture is going to evolve whether you want it to or not, right? This is about being intentional about the direction culture is going to evolve in. Because the interactions between people, the interactions between your stakeholders is ultimately going to lead to emergent ways of thinking, emergent ways of behaving, which is going to influence processes and strategic priorities. So if you just let that go without any clear intention, culture will just continue to evolve based on the system that it's operating within. So if you want to really change the culture, you have to really think about those key mechanisms and really focus in on the strategic outcomes and what you need to do systemically, right, and to ensure that all of your employees are working towards those strategic goals, and any new initiatives, any new strategies that are going to be deployed should be in support of those outcomes.
Excellent. Now, Frank, taking a different
Mhm.
approach to this, how do you create or how would you define a healthy, if not thriving, culture?
Well, I think culture is how effectively people lead and work together and how effectively the place works. That's the entire experience you're in. And we've come out of a time where leaders spent, a good 100 years becoming great at running factories full of equipment. The entire leadership paradigm and model, that ethos, comes out of a time where the equipment mattered and the person standing in front of it really didn't. So the rehumanization of work is real. And, this age of disruption is very much about this rehumanization of work. And leaders are going to have to become adept at understanding the human infrastructure, just like they have understood their process infrastructure, their technology infrastructure, maybe their factory infrastructure if they're in manufacturing. And they have not built those skills. And, this has been a problem for a very long time. We've been transitioning into this very human era of work. And leaders still don't understand. They don't read a thing about it. They don't have a clue how the human infrastructure works. We've obviously provided a talent operators manual to companies. Think about it. $100 piece of equipment has an operator's manual. For 80% of the expense in these companies, there's no operator's manual. It's almost a joke. I mean, this is how much companies are going to have to evolve in this era of disruption. They're going to have to learn that caring about people is great, but it's also highly productive. They're going to have to get to know people. They're going to have to lead in a very human, very different way, and they're going to have to do it and learn how to do it. They're going to have to monitor it, manage it, and improve it, just like they've done everything else. And that's the rehumanization of work. And until they have deeply human, high-performing cultures, they're not going to really be able to sustain themselves in an era where competitors who do that are going to have an enormous advantage, because people can copy intellectual property to a degree. They can make clones of it, right? As long as they don't infringe on your patent rights. They can clone processes and build great processes. They can make things that look great, but they can't have your culture. They can't have your people and culture. It is the only sustainable form of competitive advantage. It is what is going to matter more than ever in the age of disruption, working your way through it and coming out of it to be a thriving company. And that's what a thriving company is. It's one where the people and company actually thrive together, not where the company thrives and the people don't. That's a thriving company. That's where we're going to end up. And that's what everybody is going to become absolutely focused on, because it is what is the solution to the age of disruption and you surviving in it.
I don't think anyone would argue that over the past, let's say, 2 years or so during the pandemic, technology hasn't helped us to stay connected. But I get asked frequently, well, can you really focus on domestic culture as well as global culture? I guess the question, Jason, we'll turn over to you is, what are the differences organizations must consider, if any, when it comes to change management or culture development for domestic organizations and global organizations?
Yeah. So this is an important question because, oh gosh, because companies all too often think like, okay, we're going to lay out our values, we'll put out our guiding principles and how we work, and we're going to disseminate this across our global organization, and everybody's going to figure out exactly what that means to them, and they'll adapt it accordingly. So first things first, right? Culture. When people think about organizational culture, there is a macro culture, but every team, every function, every department, every location has its own culture. They're microcultures,
Sure. Yep.
right? But any group of people that come together in interaction, right, is going to create a culture amongst that group of people.
Mm-hmm.
So people managers are essentially setting the tone for the culture, which is why whenever you do any type of organizational assessments, you always kind of see like, why is this department or function performing much better than this one? And why is employee engagement great here and horrible here? Or what about culture assessments where you have different locations where you have some people like, this is the best place I've ever worked. And some people are like, I'm leaving tomorrow. Right? It's like, why is it so dramatic across an organization? But there is something to be said about that famous quote that people don't quit jobs, they quit managers. Right. And so, so first it's important to recognize that you have to get your people managers aligned to what type of culture you want to create define it for them, model it for them, then equip them with the knowledge, tools, and skills to be able to coach and mentor their teams to be able to develop and sustain that culture. So that's first. Now, when we start to get into global, right, and it's not even just global, sometimes you just get into these nuances domestically as well across regions. Different cultures are going to have different values, sensibilities, different stigmas around certain concepts and ideas, different worldviews, right? And so to think that you're going to be able to come with a message and a point of view from one cultural system, let's say like the United States, and think that what you're communicating in terms of what we want to have as a culture is going to resonate within other countries is frankly just sometimes a fool's errand. I mean, I'll give you a great anecdote. So I had a client that perfect example. They set up a new set of values, new ways of working. And the goal was to say, we want to engage across all of our different global functions to adopt these new values and ways of working in order to become a customer-centric organization. However, the way they crafted the mnemonic devices around the value statements and the guiding principles was done through the lens of American sensibility. And therefore, it focused in on things like, empowering employees to be autonomous and, everyone can be an innovator, right? And these kinds of concepts. However, that's not exactly how organizations are even managed across the globe. I mean, and some of the challenges I was up against too was how do you actually engage, all of these different cultures to try to think about how they can adopt these ways of working when it's kind of in opposition to their cultural norms. And so, for example, when you think about things like empowerment and innovation, one of the areas that we were training was in Japan. But guess what? Japan's very top-down management. Innovation happens at the top. Not everyone's an innovator. Comes from the top. And empowerment, it's a very command and control way of management, right? There is not that empowerment that actually happens at every level. So there are just philosophical changes that need to happen, which frankly, if you're embarking on a change or a transformation initiative, those types of changes take a long time. Those types of changes take years, which is why it is important to kind of focus in on the cultural transformation aspects or even the cultural integrations, right? To make sure that everyone's aligned to when we say empowerment, what is that in the context of Japan? What is that in the context of countries across Europe? What is that in the context of the Middle East, right? Like you have to be able to apply that cultural context whenever you're deploying those strategies. And so I would also highly recommend that you work with local leaders, right, to adapt these. I mean, the successes that we found doing global transformations is actually working with those general managers, or those senior leaders across those global entities who are already kind of aligned to the American sensibility, especially if it is a American company, where they can be the bridge between what we're communicating out of corporate and then how that gets contextualized on the ground and on the front line.
Great points, Jason. And, Frank, as far as, I guess, measuring the culture, what are the things that should be measured or the data points that should be collected to show that performance is actually in a good spot?
Well, you have to, if you've really committed to building a real human culture, you're going to have to measure all these different human emotional experience areas. And in a good culture, you don't want people motivated who have to jump over broken processes all day, every day, because the energy is going to be zapped. So highly motivated, energized people will be just chewed up in an environment like that. So they really do have to measure using some model or something, the degree to which people have a feeling of safety. And that could be psychological safety, could be physical safety, could be openness, transparency, strategic trust, things like that. Go into that. They've got to measure the degree to which people feel people care about them. And then there's that sense of belonging. Once, you feel that people care about you, do you want to belong? Are you included? Are you accepted? Do people share and help you? Do people behave in a responsible way in the place? Do they have any sense of what achievement is and that people have achievement needs and they need to, be fulfilled? So, there is a needs-based model. They need to measure them. They need to understand what's broken and not working. It's not a company we go to where meetings aren't a complete disaster. People are in meetings all day long. They don't know who to invite. They don't know how to run meetings. People haven't been trained. Tons of time wasted. Demands coming in all the time. These key processes like demand management, where, you have these young leaders going, yeah, we'll take care of it for you. Boom. Suddenly people have 20 things on their plate. And we know from cognitive neuroscience, people can manage 3 to 5 things consciously, period. So everything slows down. I remember going in to do turnarounds and literally, they have hundreds of things supposedly going on. Nothing was getting done. And the minute you remove that log jam, prioritize, and gave people a few things to work on, everything moved. It was like a dam breaking. And so there is, humans are wired a certain way, building an environment around those people, finding out, do they have too much demand? Are they interrupted every 5 minutes? Or do they have time to actually get into a state of flow where they could be 5 times as productive, helping remove some of that environmental stress in the workplace? So they've got to measure the entire emotional experience. They got to measure how enabled people are, human enablement, and all of the organizational enablement stuff, strategies, plans, all that stuff that really matters in terms of running a great culture and a great company. And they should know all the time how they're doing.
There's, covering enablement is a huge piece in lots of organizations, and it really causes a lot of, I guess, log jams, so to speak. But another very sensitive area is the fact that many organizations have invested a ton in diversity, equity, and inclusion, but I'm hearing a lot of mixed results on the street. So I guess, Jason, this will go over to you. Why is it that so many organizations might not be achieving the results that they set out to achieve for their DEI initiatives?
Yeah, this is a topic that I'm very passionate about, right? So, gosh, it's I think for starters, I mean, it's been interesting to see the response coming off of George Floyd's murder, how companies have embraced DEI. DEI has been around for a long time, right? And and those who are DEI specialists who have been really focused on trying to build more equitable systems, including within organizations, there was a huge opportunity at that moment in time. I think those of us who have been in the DEI space for a while, I think we're surprised at the reaction, right? And so, and in a positive way, it was great to see the momentum that we saw, right, coming out of 2020 and the commitment by companies. But I use commitment lightly. And what I mean by that is the intentions were good, right? I don't want to minimize people's intentions. Don't get me wrong. I think some of them, for many companies, it was lipstick on a pig, and it was just kind of like, all right, let's check this box, and we'll make sure that we meet a quota, right? But I think those people that were really committed to thinking about how can I leverage my power, right, and my influence, right, as a leader within an organization to really help push the DEI agenda forward, we're very quick to jump on a lot of work specific to the areas of like implicit and unconscious bias training. They started to implement programs around diversity supplier initiatives, and even within talent recruitment, incorporating race and gender, surveys, which frankly, you have to be careful if you start to get into a place of inclusion via exclusion, right, in that process. And I think the challenge companies were up against is, what does this really mean? Like, what does this really mean at the system level? Because, and one thing I say, the best way companies to start tackling DEI is to make sure that for any new strategies you're developing, include those actors and stakeholders in the process that are directly impacted by them, right? So, companies were taking still a very top-down driven approach to how they were deploying their DEI initiatives without really, again, contextualizing it to their organization. Sure, we have big systemic issues when it comes to race and gender equality in this country and globally for that matter. However, that doesn't necessarily, there's a systematic way of actually facilitating that change. We just have we're very big on whack-a-mole, right? Like we're very big of like, oh, here's a problem, hit it. But then it causes another problem over here. And I do worry that because of the way a lot of these DEI initiatives were deployed, they were not done so in a sustainable way. So if you really want to think about how do you actually start to deploy DEI in a sustainable way, think about how you shift power within your organization, right? Move away from this top-down, hierarchical-driven strategic development and planning processes, and think about how you engage your ecosystem of stakeholders in co-creation, right? If you're putting together a program to think about how do you start to build a more diverse workforce, right? Well, go outside, figure out like where are those channels that you can actually recruit talent from different backgrounds. And new research has also shown that the biggest barriers to building a more diverse and equitable workforce within your organization is not actually the intention or the resistance around DEI. It's just that, leaders pretty much, not just leaders, but in professional social networks, it can become pretty homogenous in that it is a lot of middle-aged white men who came up within the system, who built their networks, of their professional networks with other middle-aged white men. And as a result, when you start to go into your network to try to tap resources or trying to find talent, you're tapping middle-aged white men for resources and for recommendations. And so some of this is also about how do you actually start to branch out of kind of your, this homogeneousness. Is that a word? And recognizing that, it also starts with your own personal networks as leaders too, and thinking about how you're actually building a more diverse network. And if you don't have that within your network, how are you building bridges to help create that?
Great points you bring up. Frank, what are some of the things that you've seen as well, as far as, organizations that have really had a great, they were in a great space, they wanted to invest in DEI, and they just kind of fell flat?
Well, I think they, set some high-level goals and objectives, but they didn't really realize them in many cases. We work with companies that source, diverse candidates. Sometimes they have to actually go train them and give them remedial training to get them ready. But, although the company said we want to bring in a more diverse roster of candidates, when it came time to do the hiring, they didn't really give extra time. Quick, get people on board, fill those roles, get these projects done. So invariably, the candidates that really weren't just prepared out of the box and needed a break, they actually weren't getting hired. And we know that factually from the companies we work with who are in that business. So, good intentions don't necessarily create good results. You actually have to make time and make room for these things. If you really do believe in fairness and equality, which are probably two of the most basic human needs, how many times has inequality caused riots and revolutions or lack of fairness? Humans are wired for that because it's at the heart of survival. You can't survive in a world where you're really treated unfairly. You're going to struggle your whole life. So companies need to really make sure things are fair, and fairness, there's fairness in your eyes and fairness in the eye of the beholder. So companies have to be tuned into what's really happening in their company. And you don't want fairness turning into unfairness in some other way. I agree with Jason. So, these are things you got to live them.
Yeah. And I want to build on an earlier point on that, with that Frank mentioned around safety and belonging, because the other challenge that companies are up against is, they do all this lip service around, we really believe in diversity, equity, and inclusion. And, and they go all out and they try to find a diverse talent to bring in. But then when they get there, they're still operating the same old ways that they used to. And, if you actually talk to, Black, Indigenous, and people of color, and women, and many women for that matter, they don't necessarily feel like they belong within the organizations that they operate within. They don't feel, and where I'm going with this is companies just don't have the cultural competencies to really understand how to relate and communicate to each other across different cultures, across different experiences, across different backgrounds, right? And so as a result, people are not sticking around, right? So you might be able to go off and hire somebody, but very quickly, that person's going to realize whether or not it's tokenism or not. And, they will make the decision to realize, this is probably not a place for me. And now you've invested all of this money and effort into talent recruitment. Well, you got to think about how you're retaining that talent too. You've got to think about the environments you're creating for people. You've got to think about how you're creating a safe space. You got to think about how people can have a sense of belonging, and really be conscious about how your managers are managing teams, and also how your colleagues are relating to one another. Right. And it's like those become critical to really try to understand those social dynamics that are happening within an organization if you want to retain top talent, regardless of race or gender.
Yeah. And it's, it's all a feeling. It's an emotional experience. And, you're absolutely right. How are all of these individual contributors relating to one another? Do people really feel welcomed when they show up? Are people being welcomed in different ways? Or does the company really say we welcome everybody? And do the leaders model that? Do they go out of their way to create an environment where everybody feels welcome? If you're not really included. I mean, people get it, and they'll just not they'll not eventually have a sense of belonging, and they'll move on to a place where maybe they can fit in.
Yep.
Yeah, switching gears a little bit, unfortunately, actually, fortunately, over the past couple of years, we've gone through tremendous growth, a white hot market of just hiring. But unfortunately, now organizations are starting to lay off their employees in droves. And the question really is, how can you help an organization to thrive after it goes through a downsizing? And more specifically, Frank, I'll ask you this question. What can an organization do that is facing a downturn right now?
Well, if you want to thrive after downsizing, it starts way before the downsizing. You've got to actually very thoughtfully identify who are you letting go. You got to be able to explain who's being let go and why. You've got to actually do it in a compassionate way, because it's not about the 100 people you're letting go. It's about the 1,000 people watching, because that's what's in store for them down the road, perhaps. And they're not going to really trust the organization or feel it's a safe place for them. So you've got to communicate well. You've got to do things in a very fair way. You should be able to explain what you did, why you did it. You should be able to put people at ease. You should be able to do it quickly, get it over with, get people back to work. You should be communicating after that exactly how the company's doing so they don't feel at risk. If you start to cover up the numbers and there's a lack of openness and transparency and people feel you're hiding stuff, they're going to say, wow, they're not giving us the truth because it's not good. And, when people are worrying, they're preoccupied with worry. They're not preoccupied with work. That's the way the human mind goes. There's just so many cycles available. And when people are preoccupied, they're being interrupted by themselves. 43% of interruptions are individuals interrupting themselves for any variety of reasons. Every interruption is a slowdown in the work that's getting done. People aren't going to be energized. They're not going to really be tied into your success as a company. So you've got to manage thriving after layoffs way before the layoff. You got to manage it through the whole process. You got to be communicating afterwards. You got to paint that picture of a great future. And if leaders don't understand how to create a thriving company after layoffs and what the design of this process is, they got to think about it. It's not the old days. It's a new world. So they've got to be very, very, very deliberate about everything they do. And they've got to have a culture where openness and transparency is valued and that trust is there. If they don't trust you going into layoff, you got trouble. And so I think it's a thoughtful process that's human centric, where they care about the people.
Yeah.
Go ahead, Jason.
I was going to say, just building on that. I mean, I think it does start with your organizational purpose, right? Your brand purpose, right? Like whatever your organizational purpose is anchoring to that, right? And to Frank's point, happens long before the downsize, right? But if you're able to say, you know what, this is our purpose, right? Because also too, there's just a lot of waste that comes when you're not aligned to your purpose strategically. A lot of, there's a lot of, you hear about change fatigue all the time, and 70% of transformations failing. And it's like, frankly, companies who have to let people go should be collapsing. Like, how is your company still functioning? You've just let go 10,000 people. What were they doing? You're still operating fine. What were those 10,000 people doing? And a lot of this goes back to the inefficiencies of antiquated governance models and organizational structures. And so, but if you start with your purpose and you start with, when we talk about how do we deliver to our purpose, this is about how we're creating value for our customers, right? And our additional stakeholders. And what does that really mean from the experiences that we're designing and delivering across that ecosystem of stakeholders? And when we focus in much more around how we're creating value versus how we're just developing a product and driving demand for a particular product or service, it changes the entire way of thinking and ultimately the way of managing an entire organization, where there shouldn't be waste of terms of human resources. If anything, there might be some redundancies, but some of those redundancies is actually how you start to get back to building that resiliency, where if something happens with one person and they're not able to fulfill on that responsibility, there's somebody else that can pick up on that work who has those types of skill sets. So I think the first thing we have to start thinking about is how we start to resource and how we start to look at capacity of our human resources and do more of a skills audit and doing more skills driven ways of assigning roles and responsibilities. Because you can go across an organization, just because somebody has a marketing manager title, for example, doesn't necessarily mean that the only thing they're capable of doing is managing marketing. They might have other skill sets that are transferable into other functions, into other departments. And if we start to find that there's less of a need in this particular skill set, well, how do you reallocate and reassign responsibilities based on individual skill sets? That becomes a much more dynamic and frankly, a more agile and being more adaptive to change as it comes, when you're really able to maximize your human resources at the skills level as opposed to the title level. And so I think some of that needs to change. And then going back to Frank's point, communicating all the way through. So if there are layoffs, it's communicating the why behind the layoffs, right? Having a very clear understanding that we are laying these people off. This is what their roles were. This is what their responsibilities were. The reason we're eliminating them is because we recognize these are the reasons. This is the reasons why we're doing this, and also demonstrating to those that are staying either why their jobs are secure or why they're valued, or giving them opportunities of thinking about how employees can create new value in other areas as a means of job security, right? And so I just think there's new models of management that need to be innovated.
Yeah, so I'm really curious, and I want to get the take of both of you, gentlemen, on this. So what really is the difference between a talent asset and a talent expense, and how does that play out in the whole plan for layoffs?
Well, there are, companies are evolving, and it's the old saying: you cut your expenses and you grow your assets. So roles that are fundamental to where you're going, whatever your strategy is, you're adopting new technologies, you're digitalizing, you're building out a bunch of stuff. Maybe you're, getting rid of your data centers and you're moving to a new environment. People who are in roles that are going away because of the strategy, your job as a company is to reduce those expenses as much as possible. If they're not adding value to the strategy, it means, they're really not important to the future of the company and their survival of this whole organization. So you've got to act in the best interest of the people who are really going to be there. There's always change, there's always transformation. Talent expenses are people in roles that are becoming less important, going away. So you put robotic process automation in, and you're going to automate all the people who are doing repetitive type work. They should know and understand that the company is heading in that direction. And this is part of the ongoing communication strategy, and that those jobs are slated over time to go away. We're going to be building people up in these areas. These are the new areas, they're assets, and we're going to grow them. And that's what this comes down to. And I think companies have never understood talent assets and expenses, and they get rid of tons of people. Half of them are assets, half of them are expenses, because they don't have a strategy. They don't understand how the roles tie to the strategies. And a lot of this does come down, honestly, to time to competency. There are roles where it takes 2 years to become competent. It's very complex. There's a lot of institutional knowledge involved. You can't acquire it outside the company. These are assets of the company. You grew that asset. You invested all that time and money in it, yet they always count, it's a head count. It's a head count. It's a head count. No, it's not. If you had a human capital balance sheet, you would have assets on that balance sheet with tremendous value, and you'd have assets going down in value, period. And that's the same thing with human capital. That's exactly how it works. Companies have to, in the rehumanization of work, they've got to become much more savvy about managing these human capital assets and what the value of them are.
And also, it's actually more cost effective for companies, right? If you really think about the amount it costs companies in terms of employee turnover, I mean, it's billions of dollars a year, right, across the board. And so, there is an expense when somebody leaves, right, or that you actually have to do a layoff, or if you're laying off, these expenses, right, to shift towards, investing in assets. Because, to me, at least, I see a better pathway forward, which goes back to my earlier point around skills development. If you are being intentional about how your organization is evolving, right, and you're being very intentional with how you're innovating the customer, the employee, the brand experiences, well, you can start to have greater line of sight and greater foresight into the talent that's going to be needed as you're innovating and rolling out new services, new product offering services, or what have you. So in that process, rather than taking on the expense of losing an employee, why not turn that into an investment to convert that expense into an asset, right? You already have there's already talent there. Can that person learn new skills that are ultimately going to be needed, right, in the next stage of the company? And why not start to develop those people internally, especially knowing how many challenges we're having just in terms of finding good talent out in the marketplace? I mean, you see big companies starting to make these investments. I mean, Google being one of those examples off the top of my head, where it's, you know, it's like, it's less of a concern whether you have a college degree. We'll train you on the skills that we're going to need you to do. And I think the bigger companies are going to start moving in that direction.
Yeah, they have to. It's part of resilience.
Well, Frank, Jason, this has been a great discussion, but unfortunately, I think we're going to have to wrap things up. So folks, stay tuned for next time when we continue to discuss how to thrive in an age of disruption, where we'll dig deeper into topics like the gig economy, how transformations work, and other great areas that are involved in really, creating areas or environments where organizations can thrive. But before we go, I want to get the final comments from both Jason and Frank from today's episode. So Jason, go ahead. What are your thoughts from today's session?
Yeah, I think, I would just say, if we're to synthesize, everything that we're saying, I mean, the one point I would consistently drill home all the time is that regardless of where you're going as a company, regardless of talent challenges, regardless of massive disruptions and trying to manage through the age of disruption, any new strategies, any new initiatives, co-create them with those actors and stakeholders that they're directly impacted. You will be surprised at the talent assets you have at your organization when doing so.
Excellent. Frank?
Well, I think, it's an age of disruption. Expect the unexpected. People talk about resilience and agility. It's ultimately about adaptability. Organizations, humans, we all adapt. It's a continuous process. Be externally focused, see what's happening, build that ability to react and respond to things, manage your risk, get good risk management going, and communicate. Leverage the talent you have. There's so many talent assets. I agree with Jason. Companies should be growing the assets. They should be bringing people on board to be part of that company experience for a long time. Once they're part of the culture and they have a lot of social capital, they're very valuable and they could play big roles for you in many places. So grow assets, be resilient, communicate, do all the right things. Tune into the next episode. Find out more things you should be doing now.
This has been fun. We'll see you next time.
See you, folks.